Dear Father in heaven, please help me this morning as I share a thought or two. In Jesus' name, amen. You know, many years ago, I met a friend who was like a father. His name was WD for Z. Now, I had to learn sign language, this WILD, the sign language, because he couldn't speak. His larynx had been destroyed by Parkinson's disease. And so I hadn't known him very long, was just learning the sign language. And by the way, his hand was so crippled up and crooked that he couldn't really make letters that I could understand. So when he would convey a thought of any length at all, it was a challenge to try to understand what he was saying. One morning we take a walk and he begins to share with me a thought, and it took me a long time to decipher it because of his hand. It wasn't quite shaped the way the books were. And what he said was, I wouldn't trade everything I know for everything I don't know. Wouldn't exchange what I know for what I don't know. Now, of course, it goes without saying, there's a whole lot of things we don't know. And by comparison, what we know is very little. But he said, I wouldn't trade it, what little I have, for all that which I don't have. You know, and I didn't really understand what he was saying at the time. In coming out of a non-Christian background, I thought the world had the answers. You know, you can go to the workplace or the university or somewhere and find the essential knowledge. And then I met my wife of 44 years, and she explained to me that she went to the university looking for essential truth and didn't have a whole lot of luck finding it.
So I ordered a lot of different kinds of tomatoes this year, and I wanted to try some of the new dwarf varieties. There's something called the Dwarf Tomato Project.
Yeah.
And they've bred regular indeterminate tomatoes with dwarf tomatoes, which means they're not like tiny tomatoes and tiny plants. Really, some of those get 4 feet tall. I ordered some different sizes, different colors, just to see how they do, because they don't get so long and lengthy like the regular indeterminates. So I'm looking forward to seeing what they do.
You sound like a fountain of knowledge when it comes to tomatoes.
Well, I don't know about that.
Yeah.
I read a little bit here and there.
Where do you learn all this? You reading this stuff or watching? How are you learning all this?
YouTube.
Yeah. When you were in the university, you weren't learning about tomatoes, were you?
No, I wasn't learning. I was learning about evolution.
Okay.
And I was thinking yesterday or day before, I heard something that reminded me that my senior year in college, I majored in psychology. In my senior year in college, I was in an honors program, and I thought when I was able to take a graduate class, which I had the privilege of doing when I was in the honors program, and I thought that I was going to get all the answers, because I had a lot of questions. In psychology, you know, you learn a lot about what happens in the brain physiologically, and but you don't learn why it happens. And so I thought when I got to that graduate class, I was going to get all the answers, and I was going to learn why this happened and how it, what makes a thought, why do you have thoughts, and what is conscious and consciousness? Why do some parts of the brain do this and some do that and all that? And I found out when I took the course, at the end of the class, I thought, they don't know. They don't know why. They can tell you what it does, but they can't tell you why. And I believe at that point I was I'd say agnostic, and I was steeped in evolution. And at that point I just was disappointed that they didn't have the answers, but it was kind of a wake-up call for me that they don't have the answers. And you know, when I came back to the Lord and started learning about spiritual things, I realized that God is the answer. He's what sustains it all. He set it in motion. God is why it does what it does. It's a perfect plan that He had. But you can't find that through science. Science is wonderful. It's good to study the physiology of things, but it can't tell you why it does it. And the answers are found in the Bible, not in a science book.
You know, Elder Frazee, one thing he could not do, he could not build a space station. You know, that's not part of the knowledge that he had. But this man, he could build a space station.
It started out small. We built it piece by piece. Each piece was about 40 feet long, 12 feet in diameter. assembled it over all those years, and now it's the equivalent volume of a 5,000 square foot house. To put the space station together, it required many spacewalks and continues to require spacewalks occasionally, just maintaining the space station. So in my career, I did 5 spacewalks. The hardest thing by far we do physically and mentally is it's a mental focus for almost 7 hours each time. That's the planned length, duration of a spacewalk. So it's a big day in the life of an astronaut in orbit. There are 4 fundamental forces in nature, and one's obvious: gravity. Electromagnetic forces are another obvious one to most people. We demonstrate it, we use it, we see it all the time. We experience gravity continually. There's 2 other forces that they're called the strong force and the weak force, and they're at the atomic level. What holds an atom together? You know, a bunch of protons that are positively charged. You put 2 positive charge objects close together, they want to repel, right? So what holds an atom together? These are hypothesized to be what they call strong and weak force. So you got gravity, electromagnetic, strong and weak force. Nobody really understands any of them. We just know they exist. We can observe them. I believe that that's a testimony to God's sustaining power over his creation.
As I think back to the mid-90s and my younger brother, Steve, who I really love, just a precious young man. In the mid-90s, I'd become a Christian, and Steve was, I guess a good word would be, unsettled. And as I met with him at my mother's house, I gave him an invitation. I said, Steve, you know, I think you could use a vacation. And I said, why don't you go with me back to the Philippines, and we can do some vacation type things, you know, windsurfing and snorkeling and island hopping and those things. I think you'll enjoy it. And Steve was interested. So we got plane tickets, and we went back. Now, I guess I'd been slightly misleading, because I knew when we got to the Philippines there wasn't going to be any windsurfing and snorkeling. We were going to be going to missionary headquarters. It was a group of young people I'd worked with. They were students. They'd formed an organization, and these were the people, you know, I was working with in Southeast Asia. Just a real nice group of young folks. Like Steve, they were young. So we got there. I don't think it took Steve long to discern that we were not in the Paradise Inn, but we were in a health evangelism type of a company. And in the mornings, we brought out little songbooks. We were singing songs about Christ. It wasn't what Steve expected, and I think at first he was a little puzzled, to say the least. So we would go to our meals, and Steve wasn't a happy camper. But you know, after a day or two, you know, it began to work a change in Steve's heart. Now, if you ask what changed him, I can't explain it. That's part of the essential knowledge. I can't explain this knowledge, how we receive it. But I know that it's a language that God speaks to our heart, and because I can't explain it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The essential knowledge, you may not understand all of it, all of how God works, but it's obvious that he works, and the result is seen in the fruit of our lives. So Steve began to gravitate toward the fellowship experience there in our group. And I think he got a lot of joy after a few days and singing those songs in the morning, the mealtime, and he was having a blessed experience. And I think the confusion was starting to clear just a little bit from his mind, and I think he began to seek something better for his life. And so after about a week, woke up one morning and I said, you know, Steve, it's time to go home. And he looked kind of downfallen. Didn't look so happy. We were in the airport in Hong Kong. I remember I just wanted to say something about what God had done for me in my life. And before I could open my mouth, Steve looked at me and he said, you know, these people, they're so poor and they're so happy, but yet I have so much and I'm kind of miserable. I want what they have. How do I get it? There is a clear cry from the heart of Steve that he wanted the essential knowledge that they had. And how did he get it? I said, go home and read John chapter 5 and 6. And he did. We got back to the States. Steve went home. I went home. A couple nights later, the phone rang in the middle of the night. Darlene handed me the phone. It was Steve. Steve said, I see something. I thought, you see it. He sees it. And you could tell his voice was cracking. He was moved by what he was seeing. And he said, what do I do now? I said, well, read it again. So I didn't know what else to say. I said, read it again. And so I went back to sleep, and then Steve called me and he said, I want to change. What do I do? And I said, well, we're having a Bible school in a month. Go back to the Philippines, be a student in our school. And he did. Steve went back with us, began to learn the skills in health ministry, you know, how to take blood pressures, hydrotherapy treatments, Bible classes. I was the Bible teacher. And at the end of the school, I asked, would anybody like to make a decision to give their life to Christ? Steve stood up. And I witnessed the next day Steve being baptized in the South China Sea. And when he finished, he asked me, he said, what do I do now? And I said, well, when you finish here, why don't you come back and join the staff? I was working in a health ministry organization. Join the staff and be part of our group there. But you know, during the time he was a student there was a young lady. Here's a picture of her. Her name was Arlene Sanchez. She was working as, I think, the secretary of the organization. And Steve told me he had some interest. And I said, here's what you do. You follow God's plan. We've studied God's plan for association, for marriage. Just follow the plan. And it can't fail. The end product will be, you know, peace, happiness, stability, permanence, the things you're looking for. And Steve did. And he married her. So today, Steve has a family. Actually, he's my neighbor just across the woods. He has the wife Arlene, a precious son named Noah. But he found a purpose, a place, the plan. He knows where he came from. And my dear friends, he knows the destiny. He knows where he's going. He didn't learn it in the university. He did not learn it in...
You can graduate summa cum laude from a prestigious university and know nothing. Know an incredible amount about very, very little, not to mention the lack of wisdom. It is no joke when I say on my show, if somebody says to me something particularly stupid, but they said it with proper grammar, then I immediately assume the following. What graduate school did you attend? No, I do that on the air all the time. And then they go, hey, how'd you know I went to graduate school? And then, then I'm stuck because I don't want to insult them. So I try to say, I said, look, I don't mean to insult you, but you had to go to graduate school to say something that foolish. You could not come up with that on your own. You have to go to college to believe men and women are basically the same. My grandmother, who never went to any school, knew more about men and women than a PhD in women's studies. When a kid calls my show, kid 15 years old, 11 years old, calls my show and asks a serious question, I immediately assume they're homeschooled. And I do, I say that, are you homeschooled? And then they go, how do you know? I say, because only a homeschooled kid is likely to call in about the issue of good and evil.
He didn't learn it in the university. And he didn't learn it from secular sources. But he heard a still small voice speaking to his heart. And he listened and he found peace. So there is a verse in the Bible that puzzled me for just a lot of years. It's John 17:3. This is life eternal, that they might know you might know God. And in knowing God, the knowledge that is essential is part of the package. He assures us, this is where you came from, this is your value, this is your destiny, and I want you to know, God says, I got a purpose, a plan, and a place for you. And dear friends, with that, let me say, I wouldn't trade what I know for everything I don't know. And what I don't know far exceeds what I do know, but what I do know is the essential knowledge. May God bless you and give you a peaceful day.
I asked the Lord to bless our garden, and one day I walked out here and I realized that He had really fulfilled that promise, that He had poured out so much food in our garden for us. He's opened the windows of heaven and poured out so much that there wasn't room enough to receive it. We didn't even know where in the house to put it. We had boxes stacked everywhere, in the living room, in the kitchen. Everywhere in our house we had food hanging or stored or drying. And it's just such a blessing to see the Lord fulfilling those promises to us in the garden.
So that means a winter of squash soup, squash cakes,
A lot of
squash pie, squash tarts,
But
squash.
Also a lot of greens, a lot of sweet potatoes, a lot of tomatoes. We haven't even touched last year's tomatoes because we had so many the year before.
Yeah.
We're about to start on those, but it's just so much. It's such an abundance. Okra, oh, amazing. Everything. Everything that we planted, the Lord blessed.
Our cup runneth over. We're drinking from the saucer.
Amen.